Welcome to Memory Lane. I'm Jacob Music. Today, I am going to be talking to my good friend Sophia once again. We're going to be exploring a piece of her very interesting life story. Sophia, thank you so much for being on Memory Lane.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, I guess I'll just turn it over to you. What is the story that you would like to share that is very meaningful to you, that you remember, that could be good, could be bad, and it's something that always, when you think of this memory, it brings you back emotionally to that place? What is your story?
Well, I grew up more or less in a cult. My parents wanted to be cult leaders, but they never had the people skills. They ended up moving from cult to cult, trying to find a place where they could usurp power and bring themselves into positions of authority. I was about 13 years old when they joined the last cult that they were in that I was involved with, and it was a very strange sort of cult. Most of their teachings were quasi-Jewish. Some of them incorporated some aspects of Christianity, and some of their teachings incorporated some aspects of Hinduism and Islam and other religions. But for the most part, it was based on Judaism and Christianity. And I realized yesterday, or a few days ago, that yesterday marked the 9th anniversary of me telling my parents and their religious leader at the time that I didn't believe what they did anymore. And I was consequently thrown out of my parents' home. And I think that it's very interesting that this is the 9th anniversary, because that means that I have been away from them half as long as I was with them. Almost exactly, because I was very nearly 18 when they threw me out. So, this is an important milestone for me, because I never thought that I would make it this far. I never thought, all the time back in 2006, that I was ever going to have a life outside of my parents, and outside of their beliefs, and outside of their cult. So that day, I really thought that my life was over. And that's why it's an emotionally significant milestone for me. With my mother, that seems to have been driven by her daddy issues. She always felt that her father was cold and distant, and as a result, she always was trying to bring a man with power into her life, usually in a sexual way. And with my father, I think it was more his schizophrenia and his belief that he was somehow special and somehow chosen to bring a message to the world, although he never quite worked out what that message was.
It seems like it may have shifted over time as well. It wasn't consistent.
Yes, very much so. He had one of the types of schizophrenia where he heard voices, and he attributed those voices to either God or the devil. Why he would choose to believe that he spoke to both God and Satan is very strange to me, but...
Yeah, he must think himself a pretty important person. You know, your parents went through various cults. Did these cults have names, or were they just kind of informal, small groups?
The last one that they were involved in had a name, but the name changed depending on where in the world they were.
Oh.
This was probably largely because they were trying to hide the fact that they were using a lot of exploitative practices, trying to blackmail money out of their followers, and that they were doing tax evasion with that money that they had exploited, and that they were using very illegal immigration practices. They would bring people in and out of countries very often illegally, forging documents and such. As a result, they often ran into legal trouble, and the last cult that my parents were involved in was based in India, and all the high position leadership was from India. They, in India, had several high-profile court cases.
Oh.
They had run-ins with the Communist Party of Kerala, with whom their local branches shared an acronym. And so on their parades, which they only have in India, they had gotten into confrontations with the Communist Party. And also in India, they had several high-profile court cases about the death by abuse of children. They did have several convictions, actually, too.
You mentioned that the cults that your parents were involved with were influenced or kind of a syncretic mixture of various belief systems and religions, but that they had a kind of a quasi-Jewish base. Was this because your parents came from a Jewish background?
Yes. My parents did come from Jewish background, and they tried to incorporate the things from my father's delusions into a sort of cult base. But Judaism, as an established religion, doesn't lend itself very well to cultic interpretations.
Yeah, not because the lack of like kind of a messianic force as well. I mean, it's not really as orientated as like Shia Muslim or evangelical Christianity to someone saying, I'm here, you know?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, it seems like it would kind of in the Jewish framework without like a messianic zeal, because I feel like maybe Jewish communities don't find like people declaring themselves to be a savior, they maybe don't find it as convincing.
Yes, largely because of the history of people who have declared themselves messiahs. It's usually ended in some kind of genocidal attack on Jewish people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess over time the community just became very jaded.
Yes.
I can't really think of, not that I mean, Judaism is certainly not my wheelhouse, but I can't think of any really movement with a messianic zeal that wasn't Jewish and Christian, that was just Jewish. I can't think of one. So that's a very interesting point.
The one that does exist is the following of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which actually I found out recently was largely driven by one of my old friends by the name of Ariel Sakahulogatovoski. But he came over here to the U.S. when he was 13. He became very largely influenced by the Christian movements here, but didn't want to leave Judaism. And so he set up more or less several websites that gather the works of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and claim that he is a sort of half god, half man, a sort of demigod. And he was one of the very large driving forces of the movement that sort of worshiped the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so over time, he sort of gained a following in what was, to many Jews, a very Christian cult.
Yes.
And so he was more or less told that he either had to stop identifying himself as Jewish or stop his teaching. And so he chose the latter and has since shut down many of his websites.
So going back to your parents as cultists, what pieces, beliefs, or concepts did they take from their Jewish background?
Most of the beliefs they held were from their Jewish background. In the early days, they were involved in so-called Messianic Judaism.
Okay.
And they were involved in celebrating a lot of Jewish holidays, a lot of Jewish rituals, a lot of Jewish worship was incorporated into their beliefs. And the last cult that they were in, that while I was living with them, was largely based on the study of the tabernacle that's written about in Exodus through Deuteronomy. It's described in great detail. There's all sorts of robes, and the tabernacle is built of very ornate materials, and the things inside of it that are created for worship are all very ornate. Many of them are gold or gold-plated. The last cult that they were involved in took this great deal of detail to mean that this is in some way a very spiritually significant part of the Bible, and that this corresponds in some way to heaven, and that to be in heaven, you need to incorporate some spiritual lesson from each item into your life in some way.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of a group like focusing on that specific passage. Certainly others kind of cling on to one, or they use a passage or a certain concept as a foundational text, if you will. So as a child, when you were exposed to these religious practices and beliefs, did you believe them? Did you not believe them? What did you think of them?
I thought that they were quite nonsensical, but I had no way of communicating that to anyone because I was cut off from the outside world, and because if I were to voice my own opinion or voice that I even thought of holding an opinion, I would be very severely punished.
You were given this message at a very young age?
Yes, very, very, very young. I was never allowed to form any sort of individual identity. What I wore, the length of my hair, what I did, everything was orchestrated or planned by someone else. None of it was my own. Even my own body was not something that I had ownership of.
When you say you were cut off from the outside world, how extreme was this isolation? And was it a deliberate practice of the organization to do such things to young people?
Yes, it was very much deliberate, and the amount changed over time, depending on which group my parents were currently involved in. It ranged from complete isolation, not being allowed to leave my house or even my bedroom, to a more loose isolation where I was not allowed to leave the neighborhood, for example.
When did you make your first friend who was not in a cult group your parents were a part of?
Probably age 13. It was someone in my neighborhood who, at that time, my parents tried to keep me out of the house as much as possible. They didn't want me to be near them in any way.
Well, that sounds like a change of direction from before.
Yes. They were very insane, and what they wanted and what they believed and what they did just changed very rapidly. So I was able to talk to and be friends with people who were in my neighborhood who might not have believed the same things as my parents, because the demographics of my neighborhood shifted at the time. But in my mid to later teens, I felt very powerless, and I felt very alone, and so I turned to attempting sort of more magical control of the world around me, out of my frustration with my inability to control anything, like, in my own life. So at that point, I started attempting learning about different religions to see if I could gain any power from them.
Did your family find out that you were engaging in magical practices?
No.
They never found out?
If they did, it would have very much confirmed to them that I was some sort of demonic entity. They always had believed that to some extent, largely because I'm very intuitive and I could predict things that other people weren't able to see the pattern of.
How did you, or when did you first realize that your parents believed you were a demonic entity?
When I was born, my mother's response to my being a girl was shame and despair and anger. And her initial response was to try to get rid of me. And that continued until I was about 4 years old. She tried to get rid of me by marrying me off.
At age 4?
Yes. Her friends sort of saw this as strange and a little bit bizarre, but no one found it criminal.
And do you remember these events at this age, early age 4 and before that? Do you remember them?
Yes, very clearly. When I was about 3 years old, I was praying with a young friend of mine, and his name was Avi, and we were playing house, as children do. And my mother commented to his mother that, see, if she would make such a good wife, she should marry your son. And that sort of triggered a cascade effect in my brain, where I realized my parents are trying to force me into marriage.
Wow.
And so I tried to decide which of my friends would be the least objectionable husband.
Yeah.
And that came to a head one day when I was 4 years old. I was on vacation with my parents, and I was on a little boat, a small canoe with my father, and we were fishing, and there was another young boy with his father on another canoe, and they were also fishing. And I remember looking at him and trying to decide how objectionable he would be as a husband. And I was just overcome with shame and guilt and anger. I remember saying to myself, you're 4 years old. He's at least, 15, 16? What is wrong with you? And at that time, I blamed myself for it. And I didn't really realize that it wasn't my fault. It was my parents' fault. So my hate was misdirected. This anger and this rage and this hatred really built up. And when I was about 7, I remember that I had sat down and I had planned a murder-suicide of me and my brother. My brother was 4 years old at the time. And I think that I had expressed to him that I was going to get us out of the abuse. And he had nodded his agreement. And so I did something very unusual for a child suicide attempt. I planned. I wrote a will. I wrote a suicide note that was directed to my mother and said, you've always said that I'm the spawn of Satan, and now I've returned to him. I kept that note for about 9 years after that. I picked the weapon. I picked a knife, a butcher knife, and I read in an encyclopedia trying to find out what part of the body I should cut to end my life most quickly. And I was very much prepared to end my life. If it hadn't been for the fact that I have bipolar and not unipolar depression, and the fact that 3 days before my planned suicide event, I switched into mania, and it was a very profound switch. I had this amazing mind-out-of-body experience, and for a second it felt as if I could see the whole universe through the eyes of God. I saw all of time, all of space. Everything seemed to have significance. That was the moment that really defined me and defined my experiences going forward. for the rest of my childhood. The combination of their failure to succeed and their frustration with their inability to come to power in the cult that they had been in. And so they withdrew us from society. They had withdrawn us from school, and from about the ages of 6 to 10, I wasn't allowed hardly any contact with anyone on the outside world. Besides, like, shopping and going to the bank, I had very little contact with anyone on the outside world.
Did you feel like a prisoner?
Very much so.
And did you believe that you actually were demonic or the spawn of Satan?
I certainly had a very, very poor, a very negative self-image. I hated myself a lot. And I blamed myself for a lot of the things that were wrong in my life. And I think I did wonder a lot of the time whether I really was as evil as my parents claimed, whether I really was some sort of horrific monster, and if there was any kind of hope for me. Their beliefs and what they taught me about who I was and what my worth was as an individual and as a woman, I think that that has negatively impacted me, and it's only really been within the last few months that I've been able to say, no, these things are not correct. These things do not define me.
Why do you think that your parents believed that they created and then gave birth to a demonic or entity or the spawn of Satan?
Well, I don't think that they really thought of me as their child. One of their friends who claimed to be a sort of prophet, whom my father saw as a sort of mentor figure, had told them that they were having a son. And he had told them all these wonderful things about what their son would do when he was grown, and how he would be a great, powerful religious leader. He would be a sort of successor to my father's somewhat divine mission. And so all their preparations had been for this son. Even the name they had chosen was for this son. And it wasn't, they were so confident in their belief that they were having a son, they never bothered to ask what my gender was. And it wasn't until my birth that they were told it's a girl. And that's why they reacted with such panic and wanted to get rid of me, because they couldn't understand how I had replaced their son or what I had done to their son.
So you were contextualized as kind of an imposter or a replacement because you did not conform to prophecy.
Yes.
What were you taught in your family environment about what it meant to be a woman, and did this make you feel inferior?
Yes, I was very much inferior as a woman. They believed that my only possible contribution to the world as a woman was to get married and to have children. They saw me as a sort of commodity. They owned me and they could sell me off. And any sort of identity or any sort of desires that I had to be destroyed, because I was just so inherently wicked.
I'm wondering how they thought that they could destroy those pieces of your personality. And you mentioned before you felt the desire to liberate you and your brother from the abuses that you faced. What were these abuses, and in what ways did they try to transform you into a blank slate?
Very severe beatings were always a part of my life. They would beat me with whatever they could find, whether it was wood or metal or plastic, anything that they could find at hand, they would beat me with. Often the beatings were very, very severe. one time, my brother, during a particularly severe beating, screamed at my mother that he wished he was an orphan. And as a result, she immediately dragged him up the stairs to his bedroom. She stripped him naked. She pushed his dresser outside of his bedroom and used it to block his door. And this was at about 8 o'clock in the morning. And until my father came home at about 9 or 10 o'clock that evening, my brother was locked in his room without food, without water, without clothes, nothing. He must have been about 7 years old.
Was emotional or mental or psychological abuse employed by your parents?
Yes. In terms of psychological abuse, it's hard to, describe what went on.
Yeah. Was there any sexual abuse present in your life or in the cult environment?
Yes. Primarily, it happened between when I was 9 and when I was 13. A lot of it was done either by my parents or by their friends, but that was also because there was such a large amount of neglect. I did find myself being victimized by people that I didn't know well. The only thing I knew was to turn to violence. And so I became quite violent in my late teens. A lot of this violence was directed at myself. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to be a part of the world. All I knew was I needed to get out. The only way out I saw was death. We were very much socially retarded and very socially awkward because we'd been alone for so long, and especially in our formative years, that we hadn't been able to learn how to develop good relationships with other people.
Yeah.
I knew that things like Child Protective Services existed, but only because my parents told me horror stories about it and said that if I ever were to call the police, things would be 10 times worse for me than they were already. And they had hired a sort of subscription service where they paid a lawyer organization to defend them against any charges of child abuse. And that organization had sent them a small card that said what to say to deny the CPS worker and how to keep them from having any sort of way of checking what was going on with you. And so I think that really made me feel very isolated and very alone. It made me feel that there was no way possible for me to get out of this situation. And then I think the real turning point for me was when I turned 15, I was given a laptop computer. And it was the first time in my life that I had something that I could password protect and that I could keep people from reading my emails and my thoughts. And I could keep people from knowing what my interactions with the outside world were. And I immediately started to communicate with people in the outside world. I started to build contacts. I started to build friends. And it wasn't very long after that that I started to realize that there was a whole world out there. And that the isolation I had been raised in was not universal, and that everyone wasn't the same. And there were other ideas, other opinions out there. And so it was by interacting with people in the outside world that I was able to realize how harmful what my parents were doing and what my parents believed was.
It's very interesting that by giving you the laptop, your parents, in a sense, seeded the destruction of their domination of you. Why do you think they did this? Did they not realize that this would open your your horizons?
I don't think they really did, because by that time I had already developed the habit of pretending to fall asleep and then getting up once everyone else was asleep and reading or studying something that was of interest to me outside of what my parents believed. And so when I received a laptop, I was able to do this on a much broader scale. And I don't think that they were really aware that I was using the internet to communicate with the outside world. And I don't think that they really would have suspected it, because I have already built the system of going behind their backs so well.
Mm. And it is also interesting that once you were given really the resources to understand your place in the world and to understand that the norms of your family system were not the norms of outside society, and that to be able to recognize what you were living in, once you were given those resources in the form of the laptop, it really didn't, in the grand scheme of things, take you very long to kind of liberate yourself, or in a sense, to be ejected from the system.
No, by early 2006, I had realized that I couldn't bear living with my parents' insanity anymore. And so I had tried to convince them and their religious leader at the time to make time to talk to me. I had told them that I had something I needed to tell them. And the day they happened to choose was the first of the month of the Jewish month of Nisan, which is traditionally thought to be the month in which the Exodus took place. So to me, that they chose that particular date, the first of that month, was very spiritually significant to me at the time. And it was, I found it both like ironic and symbolic.
Yeah, and it would be both, because not only is this the beginning of your Exodus, but because that those passages that referenced the Exodus and religious texts were also so important to some of the groups that your family was a part of, correct?
Yes, exactly. I didn't find their narrative or their doctrines convincing anymore, and they simply just said that if I just believed harder, if I just obeyed more, then it would all make sense to me. And so they gave me two choices. I could either recant my disbelief, and just obey everything they said, or I could be thrown out of their cult and out of my family. And so I chose the latter because it seemed like the most intellectually honest position that I could take. I really remember that day. It was a horrible day for me. I was terrified of my parents. I was terrified of what they would do to me, because they always tried to harm me in some way if I'd spoken any sort of opinion of my own. And I was also very unsure of myself. I really thought that I was making a terrible mistake, and I couldn't shake the fear that I was damning myself, and that by cutting off my parents, I was cutting off any hope I had of any sort of an afterlife. And so my parents, when they sat down with me, I told them that I hadn't slept around, or I hadn't caught an STD, I wasn't pregnant, I hadn't started taking drugs, I hadn't done any of these harmful things. All I'd done was stop believing what they were saying. And they told me that they really wished I had done one of the other things, because then they'd have an easier time publicly shaming me. And not believing them, they knew it was going to be hard to convince other people outside their group, that I'd really done something horrible.
Yeah.
And so they told me that there was no way I was being allowed back in their house, So where was I going to live? And I told them I'd made an arrangement. I knew where I was going. And they said, well, you have to tell us where. I said, no, just take me to my car. I bought a car by that point. I said, just take me to my car. I've got my stuff in my car, and I'll go. And they said, no, you have to tell us. You must tell us where you are going. And so I told them that my grandmother had agreed to take me in. She'd agreed that I could come and live with her. And they were furious. So they dragged me out to their car. They drove off to where my car was, and they took the bags out of my car, loaded them into their car, and drove off to my grandmother's house. When we arrived at my grandmother's condo, they threw me and my bags out of the car onto the ground, and they slammed the door, and they just drove away. The condo she was living in was an exceptionally nice one, and the valet was there. And he took my bags and he put them on a luggage cart and he brought them up to my grandmother's apartment. And he was really confused about what to do because I was just crying and sobbing hysterically. And he didn't know how to handle that.
Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't part of his job description.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I got into my grandmother's apartment. My aunt and uncle and my grandmother were there, and they were waiting for me. They asked why my parents hadn't come up to the apartment, and I told them that they had told me they never wanted to see me or anyone else in the family again, that they hoped I died swiftly and horribly, and they'd even talked about throwing me out of the car on the highway to kill me. But they knew that I'd built enough contacts in the outside world and that people were waiting for me and people knew what was going on and that they couldn't get away with it. And I just cried and I cried and I cried and I couldn't do anything else for 2 whole days. When my parents did return the car to me, someone had cut some of the belts in the engine. So since I distrusted them, I had gotten it checked before I started driving it again, and I was very glad I did that. Otherwise, I probably would have ended up dead.
How probable do you think it would have been that they would have just killed you if they knew they could have gotten away with it?
Oh, they definitely probably would have done that. I'm almost sure that they would have. They had thrown me out of a moving car before. I had a few seconds between realizing that I was going to be thrown from the car and hitting the ground. Landing on my feet broke them, and they never set properly. So even today, I can't walk more than a mile without being in excruciating pain. This is honestly the first anniversary of this event on which I can actually say that I know that they don't need to define me, that they don't control my life, that my value is not what they said it is, that I don't need to depend on someone else for my self-worth, that I know that I can control my destiny, that I can choose what to believe and what I want to do and what I want to wear. And knowing that for the first time in my life has given me the knowledge that my life didn't end with it. And I know that I might not have found all of the answers yet, and I may not have fully worked out what it is that I believe or that I want, but I know that I can. And that knowledge has given me a great deal of power and sort of confidence that I've never had before. And this is really the first anniversary of that event that I can say that I don't need a God and I don't need a master. My value doesn't come from being owned by someone else. No one owns my body or my mind or my affections. I own myself, and I can decide for myself, and I give myself value.
Well, Sophia, happy anniversary, and congratulations for making it out and moving on. And it's very awe-inspiring that you were able to even survive something like that and continue. And also thank you for sharing your story. It's very profound.
Thank you.